Welcome to the latest episode of the Federal's Worldly Wise program, in which we decode the latest international news. This time, it is quite literally a no brainer, no pun intended. We are talking about Trump's political resurrection that the world is trying to come to terms with. Quite unexpectedly, and in keeping with the wish of many in the US, Donald Trump has returned as president comfortably. This after all the talk of a close fight, dead heat, etc. So, what do we make of his victory? We need to look beyond the immediate reasons like the immigration issue, state of the economy, and the Biden administration's questionable track record in the events leading to the Ukraine Russia war and its wide berth to Israel in its continuing assault on Gaza. These are transient issues. Any incumbent government like Biden's can be faulted on several counts like these. But is that enough to bring back to power someone, particularly like Trump, who faces charges of trying to subvert American democracy, who questioned the fairness of its election process, and was in fact indicted of felony and of other misdemeanors over the last few years? There must be something deeper in the American psyche that forgave his faults wholesale and deemed him fit to return as president. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, there has been a massive influx of highly talented and well qualified migrants from all over the world, especially from South America and Asia. According to Pew Research, in 2022, some 10.6 million immigrants living in the US were born in Mexico, making up 23% of all US immigrants. The next largest origin groups were those from India, 6%, China, 5%, and the Philippines, 4%. Overall, by region of birth, immigrants from Asia accounted for 28% of all immigrants just 2 years ago. This is the statistics that was taken just 2 years ago. The Chinese and Indians, among others, are a visible presence today across the US in states where mainly whites were seen not long ago. This is particularly so in 4 states. California, there are 10.4 million Chinese and Indians, making up 23% of the national total of these two groups. In Texas, 5.2 million or 11% of these two groups available nationally. Florida, 4.8 million or 10%, and New York, 4.5 million again or 10%. So these are huge numbers, sizable numbers rather. So for the white Anglo-Saxon American who would like to see themselves as the dominant community, the arrival of thousands of colored non-native English-speaking immigrants from Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia could be a threatening presence. The latent resentment against Asians came to the fore during the COVID pandemic when they were targeted for being perceived as the originators of the coronavirus spread. Trump, you may recall, constantly referred to the COVID as Chinese flu or Chinese virus. A Californian congresswoman, Judy Chu, estimated 100 hate crimes were being committed against Asian Americans each day during that period. The COVID period was not an exception. If you go back into history from the late 19th century onwards, Asian migrants have experienced racist violence for various reasons. It started off with attacks against the Chinese in the late, as I said, the late 19th century. According to a report in the National Geographic, at the turn of the century, a rise in Indian immigration sparked what is, in quotes, a dusky peril, or what a Washington newspaper then described as Hindu horde invading the state. In the early 20th century, following pressure from anti-immigrant groups like the 100% Americanism, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act put a halt to most Indian and Asian immigration. This was lifted only in 1965. The Japanese too were targeted during the Second World War, with 120,000 Japanese Americans even being interned in detention camps, and a complete halt to immigration was put in place. More recently, before the COVID pandemic, the 9/11 attacks triggered off assaults on Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs sporadically but across the country. What this basically goes to show is that the racist resentment has always been there, only to surface periodically over some issue or the other. In this context, to think that an Afro-Asian woman like Kamala Harris could turn out to be president, not possible. This must have played a role in the choice of a majority of the electorate. Another possible issue could be the gender of Kamala Harris. Though it can never be conclusively established that this was a factor, there is a long held suspicion that the US is a deeply conservative society that tends to be conformist when it comes to gender relations. Never mind the fantasies owned by Hollywood films on equal status for women. Going by the initial surveys, there were a large number of Spanish origin and Black Americans who voted for Trump. So this would not fall into the category of the white American rejecting an Afro-Asian. In which case, did gender actually play a role? For long held notions of patriarchy, if not male dominance, must have held sway among all ethnic groups, not just the whites. But then again, if gender was an issue, why was there not an upsurge of women voting for Kamala Harris? Especially given that she was so firm and clear on reproductive rights for women. The right to abort, in other words. As an analyst explained on television, maybe that issue did not matter to women who were beyond the age of pregnancy. Plus, of course, the hold of the Christian religion and the stigma of abortion that women of any age would subscribe to. This possibly explains the percentage of women who voted in large numbers for Kamala, but not the huge upsurge that was widely expected. Earlier, Democratic candidates, including Joe Biden, in fact, did better, getting more female votes. So that brings us to religion. Christian evangelicals form a huge number across the US, and they unreservedly back Trump. Some see his return as that ordained by God through a divine intervention. So, powerful leaders of the evangelicals derive their power from huge donations and can influence voting heavily. They are also unconditionally pro-Israel and are one of the biggest supporters of the Zionist regime in Israel. As we have seen, the Benjamin Netanyahu government was given a blank check by this section in the way it has dealt with Palestinians in Gaza. Though Kamala Harris identified herself more as a Christian on her father's side than a Hindu on her mother's side, she was largely viewed as a left-leaning liberal who was not particularly besotted with religion. There, she must have lost the vote of the conservative religious American. Which brings us to the point where we started, which is that Kamala Harris found herself buffeted by forces and circumstances that were beyond her control. At this point in US history, she is probably not the type of person who can attract the vote across the board, despite her eagerness and the promise to make life better for the middle classes, irrespective of the religion, community, and politics. So that leaves us with Trump. In 4 years, we can revisit this space and figure out whether the pro-Trump American did a disservice to his or her country, or if the choice of the Trump voter was more sensible than what many may think.